You're
listening to a podcast of
Spurious Morality.
Should we try again?
This by introduction is definitely an interesting idea.
You're listening to a podcast of spurious morality.
Hello and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnstone, and with me this week I have Greg.
Hello.
I have Gareth.
Hello again.
And I have Mansoor.
Hello.
It's a busy episode. It's a busy one this week, but we're talking about a very busy episode of Doctor Who, so we've got an awful lot to talk about. So this week we're going to look at The Giggle, which is obviously the latest episode of Doctor Who, the final of the three 60th anniversary specials, and it does a bit. So here is the spoiler alert. There is so much to spoil and so much that will be spoiled in this episode that if you've not watched it yet, go and watch it before you listen to this, because every second of this episode is a spoiler practically. We'll dive straight in. And just sort of overall thoughts on the episode itself. Do you want to go first, Greg?
Wow, where do you even start? I mean, it's such an RTD finale kind of episode. I mean, it's just so packed full of stuff. I mean, you've got the return of a classic villain in the Toymaker, which means because the last episode was in 1966. You have to explain who the Toymaker is and how to defeat the Toymaker, and then you have to defeat the Toymaker. And that's enough for a story. But on top of that, you've got the Doctor regenerating, or in this case, bi-generating. You've got the introduction, therefore, of a new Doctor who actually needs to perform for a good chunk of the episode rather than just pop up right at the end. You bring back an old companion. You have to finish the story of this current Doctor's travels with Donna. Like, you have to put all of this stuff into this 1 hour running time. And honestly, I think they pull it off for the most part. Like, it does feel full, but at the same time, it feels very rewarding. Like, I think that it's structured well. I just think it's rushed a bit. But other than that, I really don't have many complaints, and I personally will talk about all this later, of course. But I thought the idea of the bi-generation was fascinating, and I absolutely adored the ending. Like this was a really good one. Was it my favorite of the three? I don't know. I really like Wild Blue Yonder as well, but this one was really good.
Yeah, you're right. It had an insane amount to do, and really not that long to do it. I think it ended up being 1 minute longer than the other specials or something like that. So it really is just packed with things, and things that change the past of the show and the future of the show, and establish all sorts of new stuff, and set us up quite nicely for potentially, 2 spin-off series there maybe. Sets up that the Master might be returning at some point, and all sorts. Brilliant. Gareth, what about you?
Well, I did enjoy it, but it is incredibly busy, and honestly, I'm not really sure how I felt about it, because it's hitting so many notes. Right away, agree with Greg. It's very RTD finale. It just has that feeling. It even includes a bit where the Doctor gets to say, humanity, oh, it's wonderful. but also terrible, which very much was a moment of like, Russell's back. He loves that. Um, but yeah, there's so much going on that it was just like having a 3-course meal or something all in one go, and it really kind of made me. It sort of put into sharp relief for me that the specials have kind of felt like there is a season of Doctor Who that Russell went off and made that is not wildly dissimilar from his previous efforts, and he's chopped off episode 1, episode 10 maybe for Wild Blue Yonder, and episode 13, and we've just got those. And I kind of one thing I think this episode maybe was lacking was it would have been nice if we could have sort of seeded in the Toymaker a bit more through the 3 to sort of unify them. We can't for plot reasons. They do establish in this one that the events of Wild Blue Yonder are what made this happen. But yeah, it felt a little bit like we'd kind of chucked a season of Doctor Who into a blender to get these 3 specials, and that was very, very apparent in this episode because there's so much happening. But yeah, we'll get to it. But the stuff in it that's big and weird, I think I'm okay with. So I walked away from it kind of thinking, yeah, that was all right. It was an awful lot, but yeah, I don't think it was a mess as such. It's possibly too much to make sense of in one go.
And of course, we're all here less than 24 hours later trying to pick it apart for this, and it still feels like it's a very initial sort of take that I'm kind of giving here. Like, I don't think the excitement has quite worn off yet, and I think that if I were to watch it again, I might start picking holes in it and that kind of thing. But immediate reaction is, yeah, that was great. That was good. It did a lot. It was very busy. Mansoor, what about you? What are your thoughts on it?
It was very packed. This could have easily been restructured as a 2-part finale. There was so much going on there. You could have had a whole episode in the past and the Toymaker's domain, and then you could have had a whole final episode back in the present. Like I was thinking at first, it doesn't really stop for breath, but I think it actually does. Like there's a couple of nice moments that are squeezed in earlier on, and then the whole ending is quite leisurely, and it doesn't feel rushed to me at all. It's almost quite Return of the King-ish, like taking a good chunk of the running or end of time, like taking a good chunk of the end of the episode to wind down and give characters a lot of closure. So yeah, could have been longer to give a bit more breathing room, but I think they found that breathing room within this running time. And yeah, just an initial impression, I really liked it, and I like how it works with the other 2 specials, and how they all kind of they're distinct stories in isolation, but they tell a complete story about the 14th Doctor and how he's a little bit different from the 10th, and why that is, which all ties into the ending as well.
And I think it finally gave us the Donna ending that we wanted. The Donna ending that we've actually wished we had since 2008, because it was a pretty horrible place to leave Donna. Journey's End was, and End of Time obviously didn't do anything about it.
I don't know. I think there's controversy there whether or not a viewer is happy with how it was left. But yeah, it's certainly nice, isn't it? It's a very nice ending.
Yeah, it's a happy ending for Donna, which I'm glad we do have now. But we'll talk more about the end afterwards, towards the end, believe it or not. So obviously the sort of focal point of this was that it brought back the Toymaker, who hasn't been on telly since the mid-60s, but has popped up in Big Finish and comics and books and that kind of thing. And this episode kind of conveniently just ignores them a bit, and let's just pretend that we're talking about the Celestial Toymaker and nothing else here. And I'm actually okay with that. I don't feel as though a huge chunk of Big Finish has just been thrown into some kind of cannon shredder. But I thought the character was great. I thought it was a great portrayal. Neil Patrick Harris is quite possibly the sort of biggest name that's ever been in Doctor Who, certainly currently, And what a brilliant bit of casting more evidence, and we've talked about this in the two previous episodes where we've looked at the other specials. You can see that budget on screen. Like, we're attracting Hollywood now, and it looked great, and the toy maker's realm was fantastic. We didn't spend a lot of time there. I thought we might spend a bit more time there, but yeah, so let's just talk about the toy maker for a bit, compare it to Celestial Toy Maker, talk about whether we can in any way, shape or form reconcile this with expanded universe stuff. So Greg, do you want to go first? Talk to us about the toy maker.
I think the toy maker obviously comes off much better here than in the 1960s serial. The issue with that story is that it is incredibly tedious and boring and largely uninteresting. We mostly watch the characters just play board games at each other for an hour and a half, and it's really not good. It's one of the worst Doctor Who serials, period. But the toy maker himself is a fascinating figure in that, because first of all, it's suggested very strongly that the Doctor has met the toy maker before that even, and just the idea of this being that's so powerful that it can force the Doctor into playing this game is interesting. And I think that because the story was lost and because people don't see how bad it is, that they that just the character was able to kind of separate from the story and become this sort of iconic figure. And then in the 80s we were supposed to have another toy maker story, but of course we didn't get it, so that just adds to that legend. And so everyone has like the toy maker built up as this like legend of Doctor Who. And I think in the Giggle, for the first time, we see that concept actually used to a fuller extent. I mean, the RTD loves his villain musical scenes, evidently, with the Master at the end of season 3, and now Neil Patrick Harris lip syncing to Spice Girls here, which I thought was absolutely delightful. But that scene is actually terrifying. I mean, the point where he turns the unit soldiers into balls, and then look into the ball, and there's a screaming face in it, and it's like, good lord, that's uncomfortable. And it really it demonstrates simultaneously how powerful the toy maker is and how like disinterested he is in the value of life or anything like that. And it's this mad trickster god basically, and that to me works really well. Neil Patrick Harris himself was excellent. um, I I would be very happy to bring this character back at some point if you could get him again, because I thought he absolutely nailed it. I think that they threw some interesting things in there. Like the Doctor says, "Oh, we can be celestial," um, because of course they don't want to use that term related to the character, because I know we had a linguistic debate about what the double meaning of celestial was, and some of the potentially racist undertones of the original story. So of course they stayed away from that aspect of it, but then they kind of nodded to it as well with the brief moment of racism from the toy maker right at the beginning. So they didn't completely ignore that aspect of the original story. Really, the only downside that I have to the toy maker here is the ending of the episode, which I felt was just a little flat. Like the toy maker is this insanely powerful character, and yet he's defeated through this fundamentally silly game of catch. And while that's very Doctor Who, it just kind of doesn't really sell the character at the level that it could. But to me, I think that just kind of shows that ultimately, like, if you're going to beat the toy maker, you have to beat him at a game. And so in the Celestial Toy Maker in 66, it's just the Doctor doing that thing where you move the tiles between the sticks, and here it's playing catch. And I don't think there is a game you could play that, you know, would be that much more exciting. So I don't know that there is a way really to do that. And I think they did the best they could. And I think that that's a very memorable villain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right about us sort of finally seeing this character at full power, as it were. The Toymaker is sort of one of the most powerful beings in the Whoniverse, and whether that's just sort of fandom has built him up to that level over 60 years almost, or whether that was originally intended, it's certainly such a really interesting concept, and I guess he's kind of up there with the Guardians and Fenric and the Gods of Ragnarok and that kind of thing as sort of all-powerful and all-consuming. Gareth, what are your thoughts on the Toymaker?
Well, yeah, it's definitely a huge step up from the original story. And I think one of the problems people have with the story, rightly, is that it's so episodic. Because you show up in the Toymaker's realm, you know you've got to beat him. So it's a case of you must play games or you must answer riddles. And the problem with that setup is it can be as long or as short as you want, and everything that goes in the middle is quite disposable. There was a Big Finish lost story called The Queen of Time, which kind of followed the same pattern, and it's very enjoyable. But again, you feel like all of the stuff in the middle could be any length. And The Mind Robber, which everybody loves, I think follows a similar path, but just executes it a lot better. So, yeah, with the original Celestial Toymaker, you believe that the character is powerful and everything, but maybe it's not the best showcase for that. And in a way, I feel like this is a much better showcase because the casting is incredible. I loved the creepy Spice Girls bit. I mean, I'm not really someone who listens to Spice Girls a lot, but that song is now going to be synonymous with terrifying body horror. So good job. I do think the ending was a little bit damp, just with the you've got to beat the Toymaker or something. Because it's probably worth noting that the original Doctor cheated when he won the Trilogic game. He had to impersonate the Toymaker in order to play the final move from within the TARDIS. He was kind of boxed into a corner that way. I'm a bit surprised they didn't bring it up, but maybe that's a level of lore they don't want to get into. But yeah, so I was kind of thinking, my God, how's he going to do it this time? And it's a moment of it's like he's just good enough. So he's just the two doctors obviously. They can throw the ball and he'll not catch it, and I kind of felt a little bit like that's a little bit convenient. And I do agree, like the Doctor successfully chucking a ball, there is something a little bit charmingly haphazard about that that's quite Doctor Who, but as a solution, in a way, I felt like I was kind of seeing the sort of the march of the last 20 minutes needing to happen, and it just being like, oh, let's just get there. So I would agree that it's hard to come up with games that are sort of interesting, but at the same time, I really hope we see the character again, and there's no reason we won't, because he's not dead or anything. But I want the focus to be on that and to kind of really get into the kind of nightmarish craziness, because all of the havoc he's wreaking, we kind of step away from it, and we know it's there and it's carrying on, and at the end of the episode, it's neatly tidied away. But I really wanted to kind of dive into it and have more games. And what it reminded me of, it's interesting, you mentioned expanded media earlier on. I don't know if anybody else got this, but it really reminded me of A Death in the Family, the Big Finish story, because the Word Lord is quite an equivalent character in that. He's got powers that are just sort of beyond your comprehension. And he's coming back from a certain realm, and he's furious with the Doctor. And there's this just enormous atmosphere of the entire world is going awry because of this one character who's got a vendetta. And I don't know if Russell T Davies went off and listened to Death in the Family at some point. He should. It's really good. But yeah, it was a very similar kind of build up to that, and that story can kind of focus more on what he's doing and the chaos of that. So yeah, I thought it was a good showcase. Neil Patrick Harris is fantastic. But I felt like the constraints of this episode has a lot of heavy lifting to do. Potentially meant that we were seeing a bit of a thriftier version of the character and his abilities than maybe we could. But that's okay. I think they will probably bring him back, and we'll, get some more craziness on display.
I quite liked the fact that he was defeated by David Tennant chucking a spherical object, because it's how David Tennant's Doctor defeated his first ever villain. He threw the Satsuma in Christmas Invasion, and I thought there was a nice little bit of bookending there. So I'm not unhappy with the game of catch, actually, and I'd much rather have a 2-minute game of catch where we just see the brand new Doctor and the 14th Doctor both having a bit of a laugh, actually, having a bit of fun. I'd much rather that than the 4 episodes of the Celestial Toymaker where we have to roll the dice and go back 3 spaces and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, I wasn't unhappy with it, and I was kind of glad we did that over a game of Snakes and Ladders or whatever.
I do real quick just want to talk about the I don't know if they filmed like a different game of catch and it didn't work and they had to come back to it, but you can really tell in the edit that they didn't have much there. Like every throw of the ball is a close up on who's throwing it, and then you cut immediately to a close up of the person catching it who already has the ball in their hand. Like you very rarely actually see anyone throw a ball, and I'm just wondering if that was the intent from the beginning or what.
Just covering up bad throwing, maybe. Mansoor, your thoughts on the Toymaker?
Just to say, like I've got a lot of affection for the original story, but that's only because I came to it through the Target novel, and I filled out all the visuals and bizarre characters with my mind. Like I really loved the Mind Robber novelization for the same reasons. Like the Doctor's out of his comfort zone, outside of normal space and time, and it's just a fascinating setup when you're used to like the rules of a regular Doctor Who story. But I do agree, Greg, that like when I saw the surviving episode, it did all look a bit more sort of tawdry and ordinary than it all was in my imagination. Um, but on the Toymaker himself, yeah, agree what others have said, and just to say, like he puts on all these different accents, but when he switches to his English accent, I took that to be like his default and like the mask slipping. And when he did that, I could really, really see the original portrayal coming through in a sort of like nicely creepy and uncanny way. Uh, yeah, and they don't directly tie to all those extended universe stories we've mentioned. But what they did tie to was the idea of him being this godlike elemental being, which is very like 90s novels in terms of ideas, totally in the spirit of those extended media stories. And on that subject, we mentioned we want to see the Toymaker again. I'm actually like, I wouldn't mind that, but I'm actually more excited about stuff that Russell T Davies has hinted about in terms of there being a wider pantheon of gods. Again, that's because I'm a novels fan, and it's like bringing up lots of memories of what they did in those books. But they mention He Who Waits, and there's these hordes and armies that are on the way, and I'm really excited about how that's going to pan out. Like, who are the people that the Toymaker is scared of? So yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to.
It really does feel as though it is venturing into sort of genuine higher power territory in the Whoniverse, which, yes, we've had before. We've had big finish arcs about the 7th Doctor deciding he's going to take on a load of gods, and we have had the Guardians and the Key to Time done a couple of times in a couple of ways, and all that sort of thing. And if we're going in that direction, and I think we should be going in that direction, because Doctor Who is bigger than it's ever been before. It has got more cash behind it. It's got flipping Disney behind it. So maybe it can actually realise all of this sort of thing in a way that works. And I've mentioned things like the Gods of Ragnarok already. 3 statues in chairs, and I've mentioned Fenric already, and it's the bloke that's been in the other 3 episodes, but his eyes are yellow now. We can do something bigger than that. All the stuff with the Toymaker going on, that big music scene with the Spice Girls, and Greg mentioned the absolutely horrific imagery of the soldiers being turned into balls, and one of them a face in a ball screaming. It was very Twin Peaks. There was something very Twin Peaks about that. Yeah, finally we can sort of have a really good version of this kind of villain on screen, and it isn't just a bit of a dull set at the back of a studio or that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's exciting, but I hope they hold on to the human element as well, and I think they did that with this story, where you do have that sort of Neil Gaiman approach of like a god, but they're walking around in human form, because that allows you to engage with the character. But then, yes, all this extra, money and resource can go into give a little bit of showiness and theatrics and special effects to complement that human performance. I wouldn't want to like have the Doctor just encountering like big expensive CGI gods. Having a performer like Neil Patrick Harris at the center of it is still really key to it, I think.
Well, that's what they did with Impossible Planet and Satan Pit, where they had the gigantic CGI devil,
Yeah,
but then said, well, actually, this is just an empty shell, and the real
yeah,
quote unquote devil's spirit is entered a person, and then you actually get a human performance of it. So
exactly. Yeah,
I think that kind of thing can work really well.
I think in both cases we do get the best of both worlds, and it's in both of them it's kind of played for horror on quite a few occasions. So yeah, hopefully there'll still be that balance, there'll still be a performance, because I wouldn't want something like the Gods of Ragnarok to come back, but they're just a big CGI cloud or something. I'd quite like it to actually, go somewhere and that sort of thing. But I'm looking forward to kind of what we've got. We've had a few little hints of what's to come now, with the Meep referencing the boss, and as I mentioned earlier, the tooth that supposedly has the master trapped in it, and all that sort of thing. There's a lot being set up. There's a lot that's going to link to these specials, and I've heard it described somewhere that these specials are kind of the finale to the series of Doctor Who that started with Rose in 2005. But I don't think it is any more than, let's say, The Day of the Doctor was, which also set up plenty of stuff for moving forward and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where we go next and what we have next and what's bigger than the toy maker and that kind of thing. So we were introduced to a new concept, one that potentially will change the Whoniverse forever, and that is by generation. Instead of one Doctor dying and being replaced by another, we have a Doctor splitting out from the other one as part of the regeneration process, and regenerations going wrong or being strange or that kind of, not exactly new concepts. They're not even new concepts for Russell T Davies. But this is a good one, and it allowed this to be a multi-Doctor story, almost by stealth. I really like how it played out. I really like how they did it. I really like the interaction between the two Doctors, and we now have almost as if we have two current Doctors running around. Donna gets her own David Tennant, just as Rose did, and we have Ncuti Gatwa going off into space and being the Doctor. So what do we think of the concept of bi-generation, and how long do we think it's going to be before we see 14 again? So Greg, you go first.
I like the idea. I think it works well as sort of a new way to approach a multi-doctor story. We've never had one where the current doctor meets a future doctor, and I mean, obviously there's a debate over who's the quote unquote current doctor in those scenes, but that's essentially what this is, and I thought that was fascinating. I the controversy that's erupted over this seems to largely stem from what RTD was saying in the commentary about how, oh, this applies to all the previous regenerations and so on, and like I don't really care much about that unless it actually turns up in the TV show. So I'm not really like engaging with that idea, because like he can say whatever he wants, but if it never comes up in the show, what difference does it make? You can interpret it however you want, really. And to me, just in this specific instance, um, I think it's more of a function of what they wanted to do in production terms. Because while I agree that this isn't like this defined end of Doctor Who or anything like that. It is sort of an episode that's intended to wind down one era of Doctor Who and build up another era of Doctor Who. And because of that, it's very difficult to do it in the traditional way where Doctor number 14 dies and then Doctor number 15 is born, because now you have that just direct connection between the two of them. And the Doctor's circumstances create his successor, which is how it always happens. Whereas here you can actually give like the pre-season 14 era of the show an ending. I've always thought that if you were going to end Doctor Who, like not just like stop it and just have the Doctor just go off on adventures, but if you were actually going to come up with a last episode, it would have to be the Doctor finally finding a way to retire, because you can't just you can't end 60 years of the show with the Doctor like dying heroically. Like that would be unrewarding no matter what the circumstance was. So it would have to be the Doctor retiring. And by doing it this way, they actually are able to give the quote unquote old show that ending. And at the same time, they're able to start a new show. So, I don't think this is really intended to set up like ongoing David Tennant, Catherine Tate episodes or anything like that. I think it's intended just as an ending to that. And we're meant to take away from it that eventually this Doctor is going to die somehow. And I think it's a little confusing how it was put forward, but the impression I get from it is that at some point this Doctor 14 is going to, I suppose, regenerate or just die and disappear, and then Ncuti Gatwa will appear back in this episode, having experienced all of David Tennant's decompression time, and be the healthier, more well-adjusted character that we saw. I think so. As a tool to accomplish all that, I thought it was very smart. I thought it was elegantly done. In terms of like the fiction of the show, it's weird. We've never seen it before, but that's been the part and parcel of regeneration since the beginning. So I really had no issue with it. In fact, I liked it. The more I was watching it, the more I was like, you know what, this works. Because anything that gives us that scene where the 15th Doctor comforts his former self with a hug like that was worth it to me.
Yeah, absolutely. If, like I said before, if nothing else, it allowed for this to be a very, very different kind of multi-Doctor episode. And yeah, it's set up for the future. It's sort of made sure that the past is nice and securely settled, I guess. Yeah, it's a great old concept, I think. Gareth, what about you? What do you think of Bi-Generation?
Well, I'd heard kind of rumors online, not from looking for them, they just were there, about some sort of split regeneration. And it sounded sort of, oh, God, what's that about? And obviously, Russell T Davies put out his, for the love of God, brace yourself for spoilers warning, which was quite fun, just before the episode aired. So I was kind of thinking, okay, if this happens, all hands on deck, this is going to be weird. Once it actually happened, first of all, I thought they carried it off very well. All of the stuff, really just the fact that he arrives and he's not in a crisis, as the Doctor usually is after a regeneration, gave it a very different flavour, and he was able to be comforting to Tennant's Doctor, which was just something we've never seen before. Famously, what do you get when you interact two sort of Doctors who are next to each other bickering? That's the rule. That's what you always get, and this was totally the opposite. So I thought they carried it off very well. I don't fully understand the specifics of what it was that actually happened. I don't know if that matters. It could just be me being a bit dense in the moment, but it did make me think. It's sort of hinted that he is going to benefit from David Tennant's ongoing characterization, so therefore he must be from the future, but I don't really know what that means. Like, eventually David Tennant will turn into the next guy, and the next guy will quantum leap forward into this moment, maybe. Or he's a completely separate being, and David Tennant will go off and as Greg says, maybe die or maybe regenerate. I don't know. I kind of feel like he's probably not just going to die, because that's probably a bit too close to the Metacrisis Doctor who's over living with Rose, and he's effectively mortal. So on the whole, though, it was surprisingly not an issue for me, because I thought, well, I don't know what difference this actually makes, other than the fact that there's more Doctors out there, and there's always Doctors out there, because of the nature of time travel. There's always, go to any time and place, it's unknown which Doctor you're going to bump into. So that's still true. You've got Gatwa flying around out there on the one hand, potentially you've got Tennant flying out there as well, and then you might have Smith or Hunt or whoever. So I thought, in the moment, I don't really know that this makes a great deal of difference to Doctor Who going forward. I understand that it makes a huge difference for branding, because you can say to new viewers, here we go, jumping on point. Who is the Doctor? Well, kind of a mysterious figure, but he starts with Ncuti Gatwa, and that's kind of all you need to know. I respect all of that. That's fine. But in terms of Tennant, I've really got no idea, because I've never really bought into the idea that, he says, living day by day is just the one adventure I can never have, because it's just like, well, just do it. Yeah, you can. And we've seen him try it. Matt Smith tried it in The Power of Three for plot reasons, and he was bored out of his mind. So we can see that Tennant is very happy in that situation. Obviously, he loves Donna. He's really fond of Donna's family. So yeah, I totally accept it's a happy ending. But he's got a TARDIS, and we know he's already been on trips. So I kind of think, well, he's not really settled. I mean, he kind of says, "Oh yeah, this is my family, this is my home," and I get it. That's all fine. But again, I kind of feel like I don't really know that this is wildly different from the norm. This is a bit like Pertwee. He finally breaks out of his exile on Earth, but then he obviously still loves Earth, so he's still buzzing around and still hanging around with Unit whenever he can. So I'm very interested to know what's going to happen going forward. I feel like you could pack them off. You could say that's a golden wrap or whatever they call it for David Tennant, but plot-wise, I don't think there's any reason to, because he can still get in the TARDIS and just go, and he will. I mean, he had the choice on the spot to basically bequeath the TARDIS if he wanted to, and he said no. So I just, people can have different reactions, and that's all perfectly fine. For me, I don't believe he would stop doing Doctor stuff. And then that raises the question of, an asteroid hits Earth. Ncuti Gatwa is over there on Mars doing something else. Does David Tennant not jump into the fray? I don't think so. I think he will. So it's a question of, I'm fine with it as it is, but I'm very interested to see how this pans out. I mean, it could absolutely be a crossroads and see you later, alligator, David Tennant. Could be. But if it was, I kind of feel like this is an awful lot of effort for that. So yeah, we'll see. I'm fine with it, but we'll see.
I think, to be perfectly honest, I know Russell T Davies has clarified it a bit in the commentary. I've not actually listened to that yet, but in all honesty, I think it's going to be left as ambiguous as possible, so it can be whatever it is needed to be further down the line. And I think that's probably the best way of doing it. Like, here's a concept, something happened, we don't really understand it, but if in 4, 5, 6, 10, 20, whatever years' time, this particular little bit of the Whoniverse is required to be dusted off, then we can do that, and we can be a little bit more specific about what it is. And again, it's not the first time that that's happened. Mansoor, your thoughts on By Generation?
Yeah, just on that last point, like it's that is a good thing about why wouldn't David Tennant's Doctor jump in and help? But it's not a unique problem. You get this with like comic book universes all the time. You have all these overpowered heroes, and you just find a way of making it work narratively in each individual story by just either ignoring it or not drawing attention to it. And we kind of had it with Torchwood as well. Like Torchwood came up against some pretty big stuff, and the Doctor didn't come and help, and you just explain it as like, well, it's a fixed point, he can't interfere, or there's always a way around it. But on the bi-generation, I think, like we've said, we've all got lots of questions. Whether 15 will bi-generate when he leaves. What's the future of the David Tennant 14th Doctor? Is it a linear split? Does this tie into Tales of the TARDIS? How this affects all the extended media like Endgame or Divided Loyalties or Solitaire? Those are all things that we care about and we're thinking about. But I think it's worth keeping sight of the fact that most people don't. And most people are just going to see a really cool new twist on a regeneration that's going to be exciting and shocking and surprising in the moment. And they're going to see a cool new Doctor being introduced. And that's the core of it. And for those of us that do care, I think the game of Doctor Who is trying to understand it all and trying to make it all fit in the most elegant way possible, with retcons and just like looking back at that extended universe and seeing how all those pieces that really don't fit together, how we can make them fit. And I think like shaking things up in this way is necessary and really healthy. I think it does truly set us up for a new era, and it just sort of also sends the message that we are, where there is a reason for it, we are going to break rules or establish rules or change rules. And that's what Doctor Who always does. It's introduced complete like left turns to the mythology, like many times over its history. And just like finally on all this stuff about changing the mythology, if we get into specifics, there's like a dozen different ways you can make it fit. Like the thing that I was thinking of is that all this stuff about the Doctor's past changing, I think the Toymaker has a line about that as well. It's very in line with stuff you've seen in novels like Unnatural History that are all about, the Doctor's past is actually in flux. It can't be pinned down, and that's kind of what defines him, not being able to be defined. So he's, a human scientist who built the TARDIS in his backyard. He's the half-human son of a Gallifreyan explorer. They're the timeless child, and now they are the Doctorverse. That there's potentially older versions of all these previous Doctors and future Doctors out there. So yeah, I thought as an idea and in execution, I thought it was great.
And ultimately, it as I've said earlier, it opens the door for spin-off series, adventures with past Doctors, and it lets them basically do Big Finish on the telly without interrupting what I suppose would be considered the primary continuity, the most recent Doctor and that kind of thing.
They can play their age. Like they like Big Finish could switch to having those actors playing the age they are now, rather than having to try and sound like what they were 30, 40 years ago.
I think the ship sailed on that quite a while ago.
In fact, didn't Big Finish go through a very, very brief phase of doing that? Like, I'm thinking of Gallifrey Series 4 had like contemporary pictures of Louise Jameson and Lalla Ward on the cover. Like, they looked the age they were at recording as opposed to the age they were, well, the age they appeared when they played the characters. So I do think that there was a bit of a, let's use current cast photos thing, but I think it sort of disappeared as quickly as it arrived.
I imagine it would free you up as a performer as well, because it's not just about, okay, you can relax and just do your sort of natural voice for your age. You can now tell new stories that take those classic Doctors in new directions and introduce threat and jeopardy that wouldn't be there if you're just fitting everything into like these little existing gaps in established history.
And they've seen some of it. I mean, they've had, Big Finish did the older Nyssa arc and the older Perry, I guess, arc that they never finished.
For companions, they've done it a lot for companions.
But never for a Doctor, right.
Apart from Once and Future, I guess. In fact, it's not a completely dissimilar concept, Once and Future and the Giggle. They've both done something weird with regeneration.
And whatever the curator is too, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's it, though. Is the 14th Doctor now who goes on to be the curator? Does he just keep picking old faces? Is he going to be an older Tom Baker and an older Colin Baker? Will David Tennant be back to play the curator in 30 years' time? All this sort of thing. But I really like what it's done, and I don't know exactly what it's done, as we've said. But I like the opportunities it presents, and I like the idea that the past is just a little closer than it used to be, potentially. Well, we're nearly out of time, so is there anything else you guys want to add?
I guess just on the ending point, I think this works really nicely as an ending to the 2005 and forward era, because that whole theme of the show since then has been about trauma and loss. And I thought we talked so much about the bi-generation, that's what's generating discussion. But I thought the most affecting bit of this episode was the Doctor talking to himself and giving himself permission to just stop and look after himself, and that little kiss on the forehead and all of that. So yeah, apart from all the mythology vanish stuff, I feel like that's the bit that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, and that kind of links into the point I wanted to make. We didn't, talk too much about him, but Shuti Gatwa is utterly fantastic in this. He just grabs the role and owns it from minute one. And I like that they pretty much just dispensed with the whole post-regenerative trauma thing. Like, he just is born immediately as a fully formed and confident and self-assured doctor. And like I said, he owns it. And that last moment of him walking around the TARDIS console and just cheekily kicking David Tennant out, like, watching that, I was like, oh yeah, this is the guy. This is it. Let's go. So yeah, great job. Can't wait to see more.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do a really, really, really proper in-depth discussion about him when we've seen a little bit more after the Christmas special, I think. But what a absolutely brilliant way to get started. It's immediately he had the challenge of playing the Doctor alongside the overwhelmingly popular David Tennant, who is undeniably the Tom Baker of the 2005 plus era in terms of, popularity and association with the show and that kind of thing. And he held his own. He was the Doctor next to everybody's favourite Doctor. So yeah, excellently done. Really, really, really well done.
Yeah, it was such an unusual Doctor's first scene. But yeah, that confidence really makes a huge difference. It was an interesting choice. And yeah, I've no idea what it'll be like. I don't know what that guy will be like versus other baddies. Keen to see.
Yeah, very, very much looking forward to it. Okay, well, that is all we have time for. So, roll on the Christmas special. I can't believe that it's only actually just over 2 weeks away. We've just come out of a year-long plus, 13 months or so, Doctor Who drought on TV, and now we've got a 2-week one. I'm sure we'll be able to cope just about, and hopefully series 1/14 will be kind of pretty close behind it as well. I'm hoping it's a earlier in the year type thing. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. But in the meantime, I will say a very big thank you to Greg.
We'll see you all at Christmas time.
A thank you and goodbye to Gareth.
See you around.
And a thank you and goodbye to Mansoor.
Thanks.
And we'll be back for more Spodcasting very soon. Goodbye now.